Congressman David Cicilline, he's a Democrat of Rhode Island, introduced articles of impeachment against Donald Trump over his attempted coup and served as an impeachment manager in the second trial of the ex-president. He writes about all this in his new book out tomorrow, House on Fire, Fighting for Democracy in the Age of Political Arson. And Congressman Cicilline joins me here. It's good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Do you interpret those comments the same way I do, as essentially a threat from Lindsey Graham and from others who say they worry about civic peace if the president were to be indicted?
Yes, I don't think you can interpret them any other way. I begin my book really in part to sound the alarm about the threat we face in this country, the threat to our democracy, and the hopes of encouraging people to understand that must be our first priority in the midterm elections, is defending and protecting our democracy. I begin my book with the one-year anniversary of January 6th, which was only attended by one Republican. A second Republican on the January 6th committee couldn't come because he was having his first child. But that's evidence of how little progress we've made in persuading our Republican colleagues about what's really the threat here. And this is an ex-president who used fear and division and threats of violence in an attempt to stay in power after the American people rejected a second term. He tried to overthrow an American election. That work to really undermine the institutions of our democracy is ongoing. And when you see people like Lindsey Graham, who are essentially saying either allow this president to get away with wrongdoing or there will be more violence, that's a fascist statement. It's the use of violence for political means. And I know there was a lot of, dust up about using that word, but in my book, I talk about kind of the checklist for fascists, and you go down that list, and Donald Trump has engaged in behavior which meets almost all of those elements. So this is a serious threat. The book is intended, hopefully, to raise the conscience of people. I was involved in both the first and second impeachment, the second impeachment as a manager. But this is the most dangerous time that I think we have faced, at least in my lifetime, in terms of protecting our democracy and our ability to continue to live in a democracy.
There's also something head-spinning when you use the word fascist. My background when I was younger, I came up in like a very sort of like left circle, right? And I was always kind of a boring liberal in the end. But it's like, the Fascist Bureau of Investigation is something that like you would read in like a left-wing anarchist like zine or something, right?
Right.
The ex-president of the United States, of the Republican Party and ostensibly the Conservative Party, talking about the Fascist Bureau of Investigation, and people in the other party basically going along with this idea that there's this like conspiracy by the FBI to get Donald Trump. It's really head-spinning stuff.
No, it's head-spinning, and particularly from a party that prides itself on supporting law enforcement and always criticizing Democrats for the opposite. This is about supporting the rule of law. We live in a country that requires that everyone follow the same set of rules, and if you break the law, you violate the rules, you must be held accountable. We're taught since we're very young, no one is above the law. If that is actually true, then Donald Trump must be held accountable for his conduct. And to see Republican colleagues trying to make excuses from that, you played at the beginning of the show, I mean, it's head-spinning. Every excuse in the world, and no one has, that I've heard of those same Republicans, has answered the question, why in the world did Donald Trump take highly classified documents home with him in violation of the law?
And keep them for 18 months.
That's right.
What was he doing? Why didn't he just give them back? There's no answer for it. And on this point of the threat, I mean, it is striking to me. I think, people ask me about politics, I would say, look, one of the paradoxes here, one of the difficult things about preserving democracy is that most voters are going to vote on things like inflation, right? Or choice, right? They're going to be focused on issues in their day-to-day lives, generally. It's going to be hard to get people to care about democracy as a voting issue. And yet, right? Like,
finally happened.
Right, I mean, I am genuinely pleasantly surprised. This NBC News poll, which we've shown a bit of the top issue volunteered by voters, right, is threats to democracy.
Yeah, I think the American people do understand in a very profound way that something very dangerous is happening. And all of the things people care about are more difficult to solve if you don't have a democracy, if you don't have a functioning democracy where people are allowed to vote and select their own leaders and their votes are counted and they're represented. So I think people understand that the conduct of the former president and those who are supporting him is very dangerous. And, my experience in Providence, where there was a very corrupt mayor who was in office before I was, that ultimately it was the people who stood up and said, enough is enough, They elected me. And I think we need the same thing here for people to say enough is enough and elect people who are prepared to stand up and fight to protect our democracy and do not support anyone from this party that's not your grandparents' Republican Party. This is a party of corruption and chaos and QAnon and Marjorie Taylor Greene and insurrection and the big lie. They have forfeited the right to have control over the economy, over our health care, or over our democracy. And I think we have to continue to deliver. I think Democrats are delivering to the American people. At the same time, we need to characterize the Republicans for what they are in supporting this ex-president and promoting the untruths and the lies. And I think when we do that, we'll prevail. But this is, I would not normally write a book. I wrote a book because this is a dangerous moment. And I feel like everyone has to do everything they can to sound the alarm, to raise your voice, to make sure people understand the threat we face so that we can confront it and defeat it and preserve American democracy.
And again, the danger here is literal, right, in a sense. I mean, the guy that shows up in Cincinnati, the NBC News reporting that FBI and DHS have warned of threats to federal law enforcement, the spikes since the Mar-a-Lago search, sending out this bulletin which advises such threats are occurring online. That it calls on authorities to be vigilant. So this is a real thing. Let me end on that because you just mentioned one of my favorite political stories in America, which is Buddy Cianci and Providence. For people that don't know, this was a very charismatic, pugilistic, demagogic, one might even say, mayor who was also pretty corrupt. He ends up getting indicted, does time in prison, comes out, runs again, right? He had a hold on people despite everything. What do you learn from that? For this, because there's a lot there.
Yeah, I think in the end what I learned from that is the virtue of the voter. That really the only way you could confront that was ultimately for people in the city to say, we have suffered enough with this kind of leadership. Our lives haven't gotten better. We will not tolerate this kind of leadership. And
right, the prosecution ended up not being the magic bullet.
That's right.
He got prosecuted, and he comes out of jail, and he runs again, and he wins, right?
And they said things about him that they said about Donald Trump. One of his supporters said, Buddy Cianci could go rob a bank, and he would still get voted into office. Sounds familiar about Fifth Avenue. So I think in the end, I saw the worst in politics, but I've also seen the best. The virtue of people to stand up and say, enough is enough.
I strongly believe a majority of Americans across all sorts of different lines of difference are in that camp. And we'll see. We'll see what that does for the midterm elections. Congressman David Cicilline, it's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.